The Wandering Saw. The wind whispered across the infinite plain like a great black hand, casting waves of shadows over the dancing grass. Each individual blade curved under the whirling gust, almost as if it cowered under the silent chorus of tortured screams it seemed to bring with it. Each breeze was filled with an acute sense of pain, a wail of eternal anguish inaudible to the normal human ear. The grass swayed back and forth before abruptly standing straight, pulsating in response to the arrival of a wanderer in the sea of gloom. The endless grass could sense the danger, the violence, oozing from the very pores of the man who trudged through the valley. Under his step, the blades bent beneath his oppressiveness, flattening under his boot without really knowing why. The man planted his rubber boots firmly into the grass, crushing the frightened blades as he scoured the horizon of the eternal gray. The wind whipped at his long, matted hair, almost dread-like from a lifetime of blood and grime caking the strands without as much as a single wash. His face was obscured by a crude metal mask. An emotionless expression shone on the rusted iron. He was heavy-set, but carried it in a way that made it powerful. What was once a white cotton shirt was heavily stained with dirt and a faded crimson color, with a black leather apron tied around his waist and neck. Both hands wore long butcher's gloves, one squeezed in a fist, the other gripping a sticky chainsaw. He moved his head across the dark grassland lazily, as if he hadn't seen anything interesting in days. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. His only regime was the endless wander, and to find someone worthy of tasting the jagged teeth of his saw. The grass around his boots vibrates intensely, almost as if they were shaking in fear. Without direction or any inclination of where to go, he simply walked forward, the chainsaw swaying in his low grip. When the teeth grazed a taller blade among the rest, the foliage seemed to silently scream, withering away like ash in a windstorm. On he trudged, one heavy booted step after another. It was a determined walk, each step filled with unspoken purpose, silently drawing closer and closer to a blind goal that made sense only to him. The chainsaw was heavy in his left hand, but he held on, impatiently waiting for the exulting pull of the ripcord. Despite the nagging desire, it remained calm, like an itching gunslinger's hand eagerly waiting to draw the machined blade. Creatures lurked in the shadows of the tall grass, watching the wanderer in frightened silence. Not a single organism looked identical to the next, aside from the recurring theme of twisted gore and limb amalgamation. Occasionally, the masked man would stop and slowly browse the horizon, and the things lurking would duck out of sight, and trembling under the metal gaze. He would look only for a few seconds, but the concept of time was lost to this plane. The single blink of an eye could take an eternity to observe. And to the hidden pests in the grass, all they could do was wait for the roar of the living chainsaw. But there was no cord pulled, no hostility brewing. The masked wanderer simply turned back to his course and continued his slow march, leaving the critters be. Concern was not a capable feeling for the wanderer, nor was any of the normal human feelings one would experience. Deep within the expressionless face of the rusted mask was the ability to sense the power of those around him, as if he could see an aura of strength radiating from the creatures he passed. If something were to lurch from the grass and attack him, he would know, and he would reach for the cord in the same instant his opponent took a single step in his direction. Over many hills and slopes walked the chainsaw man, with nothing but more grass and the weak hiding around him. He could sense them trembling, but he paid them no mind. They were not worthy of tasting the teeth. Step after step he continued on, pressing forward through the trembling grass with steady, monotonous steps. The more he walked, the more he felt the itch, the urge to rip the chainsaw to life and let it scream. The want of the vibration in his fist was what he existed for, but it was pointless if there was no one worthy of feeling its shredding embrace. As the masked wanderer reached the top of a hill, it gave him eyes on the plain ahead, one of the twisted metal and stacked husks, a junkyard. The chainsaw man looked over the newfound area with calm excitement, wondering if such an opponent was hiding among the nooks of scrap. He cracked his stiff neck, feeling the wear of constant travel in his demented bones. He wasn't tired, and there would be no rest. The wind of the next fight was enough to keep him going, and it was more nourishing than any morsel of food or relished depravity he could indulge in. Without further delay, he descended the hill and trudged into the walls of scrapped automobiles, seeking the reward that lay within. The destroyed vehicle frames were stacked well over his head, looming over like skyscrapers of burnt metal. The vibrating grass thinned and eventually gave way to a slop of mud, each step sucking at his rubber boots as the journey grew more difficult. The weaker pests watched from their posts in the distorted steel, watching him work his way through the walls of scrap. Off in the distance, a scuffed-up jester with bleeding eyes watched from atop the wreckage, a bloody skinning knife squeezed into his linen glove. The wanderer could sense his gaze, but didn't give him as much as a glance. He was not the opponent he sought. With his sense of power, he felt the jester slip away into the surrounding abyss, withering away until the aura was lost. Deeper and deeper, the masked man descended into the walls of skeletal automobiles, each passing row growing narrower until he found himself in some sort of hallway of broken steel. He was getting closer. Every step planted brought him closer to his reward. The chainsaw was ready, begging to come to life. He idly ignored the plea, his boots slapping through the mud that came up to his ankles. An aroma of stale petrol wafted down the tunnel of stacked cars. The fuming scent welcomed the congested nostrils behind the mask. Ahead there was a standing pool of gasoline, its oily shine reflecting on the mud surface. With a silent nod of acceptance, the masked man trudged his way towards the collection of fuel. Without a sound, the man knelt before it, the swampy ground soaking his pant leg. He tilted his mask upward, long locks of dirty hair obscuring his face. As his chapped lips kissed the surface of the potent liquid, he slurped loudly, taking in mouthful after mouthful of the burning water. He drank greedily, for it was perhaps the only other indulgence he allowed, aside from the wandering hunt. The fluid stung his cheeks, and with every gulp he felt the fire shriveling his insides. Behind him there was a thud, followed by the clang of metal. He paused his quenching thirst and slowly slid the mask down, swallowing the last bit of gasoline that continued to stab at his rotting gullet. With the sound of wrung leather, he squeezed the hilt of the chainsaw as he returned to his feet. He could hear the hissing of his visitor lurking behind him, but he did not quicken his pace. He turned to see half a man, hunched low like a wolf ready to strike. The man was perched on his hands, holding himself upright with bent arms. The walking torso took a hand step forward, dragging his body that was obliterated from the waist down. He had a mess of tentacle-like intestines where his legs would be, and he slid himself over the mud-slick surface like some sort of grotesque octopus merman. His face was upside down, and a toothy mouth served as one hollow eyeball. His actual legs looked as if they had been gouged out ages ago. The butchered merman looked over the wanderer with his sniffing nostril, trying to size him up without actually seeing him. After a series of reverse smells, the merman shrieked, his coarse growl bouncing off the walls of cars that sounded like a chorus of tortured men. After his lungs emptied, he puffed his muddy chest out, letting his growl of intimidation sink in. The wind whistled as the chainsaw man looked down on the merman, his dreads whipping wildly. He stared intently from behind the rusted mask, the closed eyes and the iron burrowing into the walking torso. He took a powerful step forward, his boots striking the mud so hard it seemed to shake the ground. The air around them seemed to crackle, and suddenly the merman wailed in fear, like lightning had struck inches from his face. In a series of screeches, the torso fled, burrowing into the wreckage with its flailing guts trailing behind him. The masked man watched until the pest was out of sight, and when he was satisfied with the dismissal, he continued his journey down the iron corridor. The air grew thicker the closer he got. He could feel the growing intensity with every step, and as the metallic taste of victory was in reach, he felt the ever-evolving itch of the ripcord demanding attention. He silenced the need and focused only on the whistling wind. As he waded through the energized atmosphere, his breath wheezed against the mask, his boots sloshed in the mud, the apron slapped in the gust, and as he drew toward the end of the corridor, he heard the first sounds of his opponent's presence. The tearing came first. It was a loud, shrewd hiss like someone was ripping carpet from an old floor. It was slow, painfully drug out. Whoever was causing such a commotion was taking their time, enjoying every step of their cruel endeavor. Each tear was followed by a muffled groan, like magma suffocating under a hard shell. The masked man drifted in, eager to see the scene of his next battleground. So close to the reward, he couldn't pass up savoring the discovery. There was a loud pop, accompanied by a grunt of relief. The chainsaw man could hear the sudden gush of fluid peppering the mud, a shower of blood without question. It was a familiar sound, one common in a land such as this. Then there was the sound of a thrown object slapping on the wet ground. The next grunt was slower, almost aroused. Whatever task had been completed had just as easily been forgotten. Unable to wait any longer, the masked man reached the end of the metal hallway, arriving in a round, dead-end clearing. It was a miniature coliseum, and the junk cars were stacked much higher. The walls of scrap reached almost 30 feet, and towering high to keep out any unwanted attention. Only a few brave crows watched from the pinnacle, blood-red eyes waiting for the inevitable feast. The masked man watched silently, the source of the noise being everything he wanted it to be. Alas, the long journey had paid off. He had come to the right place. Directly in the center of the clearing was a chiseled mountain of a man, his muscles flexing as he worked on his prey beneath him. Beads of sweat trickled down his brow as he twisted the giant spiral gear of a two-handed crescent wrench. He adjusted the mechanical jaw on the oversized tool, his beady eyes never leaving his victim. A faded yellow hard hat was strapped to his head, a color that matched his reflecting fireman trousers. He was shirtless, showing his natural armor of bulging muscle and suspenders that stretched over a broad chest. With the sound of gnashing molars, he worked his jaw, a complete lack of skin and tendons from his cheeks down, showing the complete lower half of his skull. The hulking worker was so entranced on his prey, he hadn't yet noticed the masked man observing in silence. Beneath the weight of the muscular fiend was a body, so horribly mangled the only features telling its gender were the pair of pale breasts pressed into the mud. Both legs had been wrenched off mid-thigh, as well as the right arm. Each stump was a torn mess of broken bone and warped gristle. The only limb intact was the left arm, frozen in a final reach of despair, contorted fingers grasping at the unknown possibility of rescue. The masked man watched as the helmeted fiend lowered the cold forged steel jaw on the last limb, spinning the gear to get the perfect clamped bite on the tender flesh. The laborer's bony jaw clacked with excitement when he stood and gripped the wrench in both hands, giving view to the outline of a large erection in the tight fireman pants. Just as the fiend was about to throw his man-made lever, he stopped, suddenly transfixed on the face of the mutilated female. With one hand holding the wrench, he crouched, his clicking jaw inches from the girl's face. His free hand caressed her matted hair, moving the strands from her brow so he could see the side of her face that wasn't buried in mud. Her cheek wore the streams of 100 dried tears beneath a single bloodshot eye that was locked in the distance. Through twitching eyelids, she stared at the masked man, who watched in silence, savoring. As the beady eyes found the rusted mask, a ghostly scream erupted from the skeletal jaw, so loud it shattered every window in the makeshift coliseum. In a rain of glass, the laborer rose, tearing the wrench from the ground and letting the heavier end fall into his palm. With a single stride, he stepped in front of his prey, as if to block the path of the chainsaw-wielding trespasser. There were no words spoken, only the invisible rules of the fight that would now have to unfold. The laborer flexed his entire upper body, veins popping like straw all across. The masked man reached for the cord, his wrists and fingers cracked from prolonged disuse. When his digits curled around the cord's T-handle, he felt his whole body come to life, suddenly reawakened from a long-lost slumber. He waited for the opponent to make the first move, and as the helmeted fiend took his first sprinting stride, he yanked hard on the rope. The chainsaw roared to life, and the battle began, the jagged teeth moving in a blur as they cut through the air. The laborer jumped and brought the wrench down hard, aiming for the metal mask in his aggressive rage. Another ghastly scream exploded from his bony jaw as the tool crashed into the ground, throwing chunks of broken earth and splashes of mud in all directions. The wanderer had moved out of the way at the last second and was thrashing with the chainsaw, swinging wide at his opponent's face. The laborer tucked his chin and caught the screaming blade with his helmet, feeling the teeth dig into the tough plastic before it glanced off. The masked man worked with the momentum of the saw, holding it outstretched in both hands and pivoting his feet in the mud so he spun with the weight of the power tool. And turning on his heel, the masked man turned and brought the saw down harder this time. With a frustrated grunt, the laborer yanked the wrench free from the earth, bringing it up just in time to stop and absorb the saw's impact. The chainsaw burrowed into the wrench with a flurry of dancing sparks, the unnatural teeth shaving a divot into the steel. The masked man leaned into his attack, gripping the shaking blade like a heavy sword. The helmeted fiend buckled under the vibrating weight, his boots sliding in the mud as he fought for traction. He looked into the expressionless mask of his mysterious challenger, the wrench shaking so hard it tore the skin on his palms. Toxic black smoke billowed from the engine as he teetered into the cut, rocking back and forth like he was finishing a fallen tree. The mask shielded any signs of fatigue, only adding to the power of the maniacal blade. This angered the laborer deeply, and he flexed again to unleash his own power, fueled by the interrupted climax of his prey. The laborer deadlifted the weight with his massive legs and repelled the saw with a wild swing, rearing back to bring the wrench down on his opponent's skull once again. The masked man stepped in quickly, tossing his weight into a haymaker with his defense wide open, his gloved fist buried into the laborer's face, bony knuckles crushing his nose and digging into his left eye socket. The wound bled immediately, crimson tendrils seeping from half of his face the instant he withdrew the punch. The laborer echoed another ethereal scream, much louder than before. The mangled female on the ground burrowed her face away from the noise, and the crows perched above flew away in fright. The laborer clacked his jaw rapidly as his eyes glowed red, his veins pulsing like living worms across taut muscles. The next punch came before the wanderer had time to react, a straight-armed slug smashing into the mask like it was shot from a 75mm cannon. The impact jarred his neck and the shockwave sent his body reeling, hurtling across the mud like a skipping rock. The wanderer crashed into the Colosseum wall, embedded into the warped metal in a flurry of dust and debris. As the dust cleared, he shouldered a broken sedan door that tried to envelop him in an attempt to break free of the junk's embrace. The saw still throbbed with life, a feral cough of digested fuel surging through the machinery. The wanderer raised his head just in time to see the helmeted fiend rocketing toward him, already at half swing with the muddy wrench. With glowing evil eyes blinding his vision, he felt the excessive force of the wrench crushing his plump stomach, several ribs cracking under the colossal weight of the blow. The wall of trash cars shifted under the immense power of the attack, and the wanderer felt his body being pressed further into the broken steel. A meteor shower of metal and fiberglass rained down from the walls of their arena, dozens of sharp pieces sticking into the mud around them. Winded, the laborer reached a thick arm into the wreckage and grabbed the wanderer by the shoulder, ripping him from his twisted encasement. The masked man latched onto his opponent's arm and squeezed, digging his meaty thumb into the soft flesh opposing the elbow. With shattering strength, he broke the laborer's arm and twisted, feeling the sinewy snap of the joint under his butcher's glove. The helmeted fiend sucked in for a cry of pain, but was stopped short as the wanderer burst from the wreckage, driving mask first into a full-body headbutt. The blank mask drilled into the laborer's face like a battering ram, the rusted iron splintering the hard hat to several scattering pieces. Distraught from the surprise attack, the laborer stumbled, retaliating with an awkward one-handed swing of the wrench. In the staggered blink of his beady eye, the wanderer squeezed the injured arm and broke it backwards, followed by a chainsaw swing that swatted the wrench away like an annoying fly. As the laborer flinched from the wanderer's inhuman recovery, the masked man let go of the ruined limb and smashed him in the face with the pommel of his mechanical sword. The hardware broke multiple teeth from the skeletal jaw, and the laborer fell like a rag doll, inches from the bloodshot gaze of the tortured female. He locked one eye with the girl, his other one swelled shut from his opponent's haymaker. As he stared at her, he struggled to lift the wrench once more, pouring all of his strength into a final attempt to reclaim his domain. As he looked into the girl's mocking eye, he heard the scream of the chainsaw, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the masked wanderer. Despite his odds, he tried to lift the wrench again, only to feel the immeasurable pain of the teeth chewing through his flesh. As the wanderer sideswiped him, the wicked blade ate through the muscular arm with ease and dug into his ribcage, shredding meat and bone alike as if it didn't exist at all. The wrench fell to its murky grave, taking the severed arm with it. With nothing else to hold himself up, the laborer collapsed into the mud with a wet smack, just as immobile as the abandoned girl that lay beside him. The wanderer stood over him, wet locks dripping on the laborer's chest as the blank mask looked down on him. The power of his gaze was suffocating, and as the rusted mask stared from above, he felt just as much as the prey he hunted. The fight was over. The laborer had lost. Without a single word, the wanderer planted a rubber boot on his heaving chest. He held him firm, just enough to keep him in place for the final blow. The wanderer did not receive pleasure from cruelty, nor did he enjoy toying with those he defeated. He only did what was necessary to move on. He took a closing look at the laborer, and as he squeezed the chainsaw's trigger, the blade's edge screamed in emotion. The laborer released a clacking hiss as the wanderer thrust the saw downward, plunging the weapon underneath the bony jaw. A gurgling rush gave way to the grinding of marrow, the hot chain kicking up a spray that splattered the black leather apron. The laborer's husk bucked under his planted boot, and he ran the blade upward, separating the skull in an explosion of broken bone and brain matter. The saw screamed until the rush of blood and gore gave way to the tilled mud, and only as the corpse ceased all movement did the chain stop its grind. The wanderer yanked the blade from the mess in silent satisfaction, pausing only momentarily to savor his victory. He looked up to the eternal overcast sky, blood running down the rusted iron that lacked all visible feeling. There was a deep breath. And as he exhaled, lightning cracked across the sky in a bright flash. Sheets of rain followed, showering the wreckage of the junkyard arena as if it tried to wash away the madness. Raindrops seeped past the mask and trickled down his shielded face in cool streams. There was an instant of solace, but it was only temporary. When he finally lowered his head, he knew it was time to move on. Rainwater trickled down the caked blade, leaving a red trail in the mud as he made his exit. A booming thunderclap sang across the sky as the wanderer left the destruction behind him, continuing his unending search for a stronger opponent.